Alrighty, boys and girls, welcome back to another episode on Cut Rate History. A little bit of housekeeping. Um, you missed me last week. Uh, got a lot going on. It's been very busy. I was traveling. Now I am back, hopefully to get a more regular schedule. My work is ever expanding, and there's a lot going on and a lot to do. That coupled with traveling didn't give me a whole lot of time to record a video. Today, I want to do something a little different, kind of similar to what we did with the SIG 320 video, something a little bit more freeform, something a little bit shorter, and then we'll jump back into our regularly scheduled U.S. history programming. But today, I want to talk about communism and what it means to different people. It gets thrown around a lot, and it regularly it is misunderstood. And I also want to preface this by saying I am not defending communism. Uh, big Joe McCarthy fan over here, if you get my meaning. However, it is important to understand the historical context in which people use this term because it doesn't mean the same thing to everyone, which is super frickin' annoying. So, jumping right into it, communism starts with this guy, Karl Marx. He writes a whole bunch of books, one very famous one in particular, and he outlines this new political ideology that gets labeled Marxism. He is like the first communist. At its most basic and fundamental levels, communism is an economy which is entirely controlled by the state. There is no private property. Um, Everybody is at the same, ideally, living wage. Whether you're a heart surgeon or a mine worker, everybody makes the same amount of money because in this ideology, everybody's contributions to society are equal. Everybody is aggressively, overwhelmingly equal in communism. There's no private, like I said, there's no private land. There's no private anything. At its most fundamental level. Yes, is it more nuanced than that? Yes, I know that. However, we're going to keep it nice, light, and topical like we normally do. Um, the difference between traditional communism, which we'll talk about here in a second, and Marxism, the way that Karl Marx actually put it, is that the end goal of Marxism is a stateless society. So basically, Karl Marx he comes and says, the means and the people and the bourgeoisie and all this stuff, and we got to make everything equal, and the government has to take over and put all these regulations in place. However, once the ship has been righted, we're going to get rid of the captain. So the end goal of Marxism is, in theory, no government. A lot of people uh, either don't know or choose to exclude that part of it when they talk about Karl Marx. Now, what is much more commonly associated with communism is what is known as Stalinism, or what becomes known later as Stalinism. Stalinism is all the things we just talked about, except um, enforced through totalitarianism, authoritarianism, whatever you want to call it. He, in every shape and form, was the definition of a dictator. And this is where communism gets painted in a lot of the lights that people see it in today. So, Stalinism differs from Marxism in that the end goal of Stalinism is one united global state. Like, all of the countries are now, in theory, they would have been part of the Soviet Union, and the Soviet Union is in charge of everything, and everybody is in theory, equal everywhere, and it's this one global state. This is, like I said, this is where like the traditional like American government's view of communism comes from, because this is what we were dealing with at the end of World War II when the Cold War started. So when you hear things about domino theory and containment and all of that Cold War US government stuff, this is what they're talking about. They're talking about Stalinism, and then later, guys like Mao Zedong who are going to do slightly different communism, but in very much the same way, the same tactics. It's that kind of communism that they were, in theory, worried about falling like dominoes and wanted to contain. And, places like China are going to do similar communism. Places like Cuba are going to do kind of similar communism. But a lot of people who use the term communism in the second half of the 20th century do not mean either Stalinism or Marxism. They're using communism as a stand in for something else. And then, unfortunately for them, at this point in time, the American government is super paranoid about this thing called communism. They could have called it anything else, and the history of the world would be entirely different. But this was the thing that was on the center of the world stage. It was this kind of communism that, if you listened to the propaganda, was freeing people in the Soviet Union at the end of World War One. It was this kind of communism that's freeing people in Cuba. So the idea through propaganda that communism is this freeing force uh, overlays what a lot of people who are going through different conflicts and wars and revolutions, how they see it, because they're not directly involved with it. I guarantee you, if you talk to somebody who was in South Vietnam versus somebody who was in Romania or East Germany, how they feel about communism are entirely different. Speaking of Vietnam, they are the first place we see this overwhelming use of the word communism and not really meaning what the U.S. thinks it means. So, a little bit of background on Ho Chi Minh. Freedom fighter like his whole life. He was fighting the Japanese, he was fighting the French, he was fighting the Americans. He founded and was the leader of the Viet Minh, who were kind of the precursor to the Viet Cong. Um, has been around and seen it and done it. However, when the U.S. Oh, excuse me. When the U.S. takes over for the French in Indochina, he is saying his forces are communist. North Vietnam is communist. The Viet Cong are communist rebel guerrilla forces. And the U.S. latches onto this, and it's a domino. We can't let it fall. We got to contain it. All of the things that you think of when you think of Vietnam. However, this isn't really what he means. If you look at like first-hand documents or second-hand documents that were written by people who were around Ho Chi Minh, uh, he didn't mean Stalinism, and or he didn't mean Marxism, and he certainly didn't mean Stalinism. What he largely was using the term communism for is what like we would think of as nationalism today. So what you need to understand about Vietnam is, well, first of all, Viet is people and Nam is land. So Vietnam is the people of the land. And for them, they have like never ruled themselves. It's when we do our episode on Vietnam, we'll go over their like ancient history to modern history. But long story short, they have always been under the thumb of somebody else. It's kind of like the Czechs. So for a while, for forever, it was the Chinese, and then it was the Japanese, and then it was the French, and then it was the Japanese, and then it was the French, and then it was the Americans. What Ho Chi Minh wants is to just run his own country without foreign invaders there. And again, at this time, the revolutionary, cool, hip thing to, say your revolution is about is communism. But he doesn't mean that. He wants peace with the United States. He wants trade with the United States. He would have been happy to have a frickin' McDonald's in Saigon. He didn't mean those words. However, that is kind of the connotation that communism had for non-Americans and non-Eastern Europeans. So it's this odd dichotomy of what the traditional and American view of things are, because those kind of mesh together, and then like what it meant at the time. Like to say that communism was a fad is a weird way to put it, but that's kind of what happened. It was the cool thing to do. They were the underdogs. Like if you weren't part of like the Western Coalition or the USSR, and you weren't a part of this Cold War and afraid of getting nuked all the time, like there were a non-trivial amount of college dorms who had North Vietnamese flags in them because they were the underdog. The underdog is cool. So what I'm getting at is he is not using communism in the way that like the traditional West would use communism. And it's important to understand that in context of like the whole Cold War and Vietnam itself. So there is one self-contained example. We could go on about that for hours. Another one I want to talk about is South America as a whole in the 20th century. There's a whole pile of revolutions going on there. One of the biggest ones I can point to is Nicaragua. Colombia is another great one. Actually, there's a book called My Life as a Colombian Revolutionary. Excellent, excellent book. That's actually where I'm pulling a lot of this from. But if you go ahead and read books like that are first-hand accounts of people who were there and people who fought in these so-called communist revolutions, especially in South America in the late 60s, 70s, 80s, you hear the term anarcho-communist a lot. And if you break down those words, that phrase it's like freezer burn. It doesn't really make sense. So anarcho meaning anarchy, which is no government, and communism, which in the traditional sense means all of the government, doesn't really make sense. So what they're fighting for is different based person to person. Even like when the revolutions were done, there was infighting because they didn't agree on what was going on. Again, that's something else that could be debated for hours and hours and hours. However, it's important to understand that here is another couple of examples where communism doesn't mean what like Stalin or Marx or the US government meant it to mean. To these people, communism is freedom from oppression. Just like Ho Chi Minh, it's freedom from oppression, freedom to run their own country. It's the use of the word anarcho-communism should be telling in and of itself. They want, so like I said, they want this freedom from oppression, and they want to get rid of this government. So yeah, anarchy. And remember, this is even after Vietnam for a lot of it. So they see him using the word communism and either maybe consciously or subconsciously associating it with nationalism and freedom, which is odd for us in the West. But So they mush those two things together because they want this freedom from oppression and they want their no or less government, and they mush them together and they use a phrase that for them is describing their plight and what they want. So just another example of how that word doesn't mean the same thing to everyone. Um, there are more examples. We could talk about the Cubans. We could talk about China becoming the most capitalist country like ever. We could talk about a whole pile of things, and I'm not going to harp on it too much. Like I said, I wanted to keep this a little bit shorter of a video, but this came up in a conversation I was having a few weeks ago, and I thought it would be interesting to do a video on. Communism can mean, it's a word so malleable that it means whatever you as the user want it to mean. And that's really weird for us in the West because we have such this cut and dry definition in our heads of what communism is. Communism bad, communism, topples countries, all of these things. And I'm not saying that that's entirely incorrect. Like I said, not defending communism here, just explaining the different use of the words by different people, because a lot of these revolutions are going to go ahead and set up governments. These so-called communist revolutions are going to go ahead and set up governments that are not communist. Look at Vietnam right now. There's my jacket says made in Vietnam. There's McDonald's in Vietnam. You can go and especially look at like some of these people's writings. Oh, go back to Ho Chi Minh. He wanted to base the society of Vietnam on the United States. He liked the way that it was structured. There's just there's so much miscommunication because communism is such a hot button topic that everybody immediately is like on the back foot and on defense as soon as you bring it up. Even kind of today, less so maybe if you're a nerd like me, less so for the regular person. But like I said, I thought this was an interesting topic. I wanted to bring it up. I thought it's important to understand, as in our U.S. history episodes. We just broke into the 20th century. Our next episode is going to be about World War I. We're going to talk about the Russian Revolution, and it's important to understand that the founding principles of the Russian Revolution and the USSR are not exactly carried over into all of these communist revolutions that happened later in the 20th century. But that's it. Let me know what you guys think in the comments below. Do you guys have any examples, any thoughts of your own? Love to have a chat about it in the comments. As much as I hate to say it, please do like, subscribe. It does help. I'm really trying to grow this channel. Ideally, I'd like to do this full time. But that's it. Thanks for coming out, and I'll catch you in the next one.